Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ASTCT and CIBMTR joint webinar on reporting to CIBMTR during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Kira Newman, and I'm the Senior Coordinator for Education with ASTCT. We want to thank you for taking the time out today to join us to discuss these current pressing events. I would like to take a moment today to thank our speakers on today's webinar. We have ASTCT past president, Dr. Navneet Mujhale, joining today to help moderate the Q&A section, as well as CIBMTR leaders, Drs. Bronwyn Shaw and Doug Rizzo. Before we begin today, I have just a couple housekeeping items for you all today. The slides and recording of today's webinar will be distributed and posted to the ASTCT COVID-19 community page on our website. There will be a section at the end of this webinar for questions and answers. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them using the Zoom panel on the bottom of your screen as seen here on this slide. If we are unable to answer your question during the webinar, you can still email us at info@astct.org or post them directly to the COVID-19 community page. We will be sharing the link to that page at the end of the presentation. At this time, I would like to hand the call over to ASTCT past president, Dr. Navneet Mujhale, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Kira, and I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar. I hope all of you, your families, loved ones, and your teams are doing okay in these unprecedented times. Now, as we all know, COVID-19 has presented us with certain challenges, and it has significantly impacted how we take care of our BMT and cellular therapy patients. And there's still many unknowns about this virus. I mean, how do our patients who've had transplant and cell therapies do? What are their outcomes? What precautions do we need to take as we care for these patients? I mean, what are the precautions we need to take care at our centers as well as we take care of ourselves and our team members? The ASTCT has been actively trying to stay ahead and educate our community and our colleagues about COVID-19 and its impact on our patients with BMT and cell therapy. And I think one of the very important aspects of what we do in the field is data collection through the CIBMTR. And I mean, obviously, it is a highlight of the collaborative aspect of our community and our field, which helps both research efforts as well as transplant center operations. I have to say that the CIBMTR has very quickly responded to this pandemic by adapting to collect data specific for COVID-19 in addition to what everything else to do. And in that process, hopefully try to educate and inform us as to how we can care for our patients better. And they've also adapted very nimbly to some of the challenges that we are facing at centers and are trying to support our programs as well as we go through this process. So with this background, I'd like to invite and welcome Dr. Shaw and Dr. Rizzo, who've taken out the time to share with us some more information about what the CIBMTR is doing in the context of COVID-19 and how it's going to impact our centers, talk some about the data they've already collected, and also how this impacts the center outcomes reporting as well. So thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you, Doug, for taking the time to join us today. And with this, I'll transfer the presentation over to you, Bronwyn.
Great, thank you so much, Navneet. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to everybody on this call today. And thank you to the ASTCT for giving us the opportunity to showcase some of the things that we are doing to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and to respond to questions and requests that we've had from the community. We have had a lot of people show a lot of interest and give us a lot of help and assistance in preparing all of these materials, and that's both internal and external people. And so just want to make sure to go into this saying that this has really been a collaborative effort. So I will cover the first part of the talk, addressing data collection, some of the mitigations we've put in place, based on restrictions at centers, and then I will, as Navneet mentioned, show you some actual data that's been reported to us, and then I'll hand over to Doug for the second part of the presentation. So on the next slide, one of the first things that, that we realized when this pandemic commenced was that there were going to be significant impacts to the centers in terms of their ability to actually submit the both required and voluntary aspects of the CIBMTR data to the CIBMTR. For example, as many of you on this call will know, very early on, many data professionals were amongst the first of the staff in medical institutions and hospitals to be moved off-site. Of course, subsequently, everybody moved off-site. Because of that, some data professionals were not able to access the EMR, or there may have been some aspects of the reporting that they used which were not in part of the EMR that they routinely had access to. And so we realized that there would likely be a lag in reporting to us, and in some cases a decrease in the amount of data or number of patients that could be reported to CIBMTR, and in some cases perhaps no data would be reported at all. We also know that some of the staff may have been affected by furloughs because of economic impacts on health systems. This has been, in some cases, a bit more recent, and we may not have seen the full impact of that in terms of some of the data that I will show you to date. On the next slide are some immediate decisions that we made and were able to put out to the community to try and address this. As many of you will know, CPI has a process, CIBMTR has a process called CPI, Continuous Process Improvement. It doesn't sound like what it is, but essentially is a mechanism by which we can track the number of completed forms, and centers are held to a minimum number in order to be compliant with CPI. The reasons for this are, of course, data completeness. For our reporting functions, both for governmental and other bodies, it's important that we have data on the denominator, as well as we have sufficient follow-up on the patients reported to us. And so we use that in a number of different ways. However, we realized that this would not be appropriate to apply during this pandemic. CPI is typically calculated on a trimester basis, and we canceled the immediately upcoming trimester, and for the one later on in the year, for the fall, we have not made a decision yet as to whether that will go ahead. But once we do go back to the routine CPI requirements, we're very likely to do this in a graded fashion so that we won't go directly to the full number of forms, or percentage of forms rather, being required immediately from all sites. In addition, we do have a lag phase over which reimbursement for the CRF, in other words, the research track forms, is applied. So there is a grace period for several months, in fact 1 year after a form is due, for a site to be able to submit these data to CIBMTR and to be reimbursed. And for the moment, we've lifted that, understanding again that there will be restrictions to having things in ahead of a deadline. We are also actively exploring ways that we could help centers to catch up with their data once the crisis is over, or at least people have access to all of the source data that they would need to submit data to CIBMTR. To bring in data directly from the EMR, but might also include actually staff being able to help with the data submission from CIBMTR. We did address potential impacts to the center-specific survival analysis, and I won't address that any further as Doug will talk about that at the end of the call. And the other big thing that was impacted is the on-site audits. All of you will know that visits to sites from auditors and monitors and other regulatory bodies such as FACT have all been cancelled. To allow an external audit, or rather a remote audit, to be done, and those are going ahead. But this is the minority, and at the moment on an 8-weekly cycle, the auditors are contacting sites and making a determination of whether or not their audit can go ahead. All of these audits will, of course, be rescheduled after the centers are opened up, and we are giving very careful thought to the sequencing of that, and also what aspects of the auditing can be kept remote. That's something that our team has in fact been addressing for some time, and so hopefully we'll see that being expedited in the coming months. Next slide, please. We also realized that it was important for us to have some sort of understanding of how much data was coming in. This is a slide that has a lot of data on it, but just to orient you, this is a representation of the weeks of the year. So week 17 is the week that we are currently in. You see that at the right-hand side of the slide near the total. And this slide is divided into the number of registrations. A new CRID being generated essentially means a new CIBMTR research ID has been requested or formed within the system. And you'll see that there's CRIDs for cellular therapy. Next down is CRIDs for hematopoietic cell transplantation. And then there are a couple of other categories where there is a pending status. In other words, we don't have the full details yet entered. And what you can see is that in the early weeks of the year, for both, if you look at the transplant section for allo-related and allo-unrelated, the numbers do vary a little bit by month, but there was certainly a decrease as we came into the weeks 12, 13, 14. But in fact, in week 16, we saw a little uptick in the number of cases for both unrelated donors and related donors compared to week 15. And we certainly will see a lag. So for example, at the time that these data were pulled, where for week 17, we see 28, at the same time of last week, that number for unrelated allo transplants was 25. So we actually saw a doubling in the number towards the end of the week. So it'll be interesting to see how those trends continue. What you certainly do see there is a decrease in the number of auto transplants that are reported. On the next slide, I'm showing the similar data for the number of forms submitted. As many of the people on this call will know, a CRID can be generated, but actual transplant data forms may not be submitted until sometime later. And in fact, the CRID may also be a lagging indicator, as CRIDs are sometimes also developed after the transplant has actually occurred. So until we know the transplant date, it is probably representing some lag. However, on this slide, what you see is the 2400, which is the essential data level pre-transplant form. And you'll see that decrease in numbers over the weeks. Again, week 17, very likely to be lagging. And similarly with the 4,000 form, which is the pre-cellular therapy form, you see a similar finding. On the next slide are some other Now moving into the slides showing the increase in data collection that we put in place to directly address the question of patients who'd been infected by COVID-19. So we were able very quickly to add a couple of fields to the routine post-transplant follow-up form and the routine post-cellular therapy follow-up form. These are the forms on the case report form level or research forms, where we do ask whether infections have occurred. We've always had a coronavirus option, but we added an additional option to be specific to COVID-19 and added additional floating text to ensure that should the routine coronavirus be checked, this would exclude COVID-19. So these questions have been in the FormsNet database for what will be instituted in early May. Next slide, please. The reason that these took a few more weeks to go into operation is because these are forms that are essential forms required by to be entered by all sites for all patients, and therefore need to have approval by the OMB for time studies. And we were able to get a very rapid approval from the government to make these changes, and these are now embedded within the forms and will become available as shown here on May 8th. The increased data collection that we'll then be able to do, firstly, asks for the coronavirus or COVID-19 as where they felt that although COVID-19 was not the primary cause of death, which might, for example, be GVHD, that it was very important for us to understand that that was also a factor that contributed. And so on both the TED level and the CRF level, those causes of death will be available to be used. In addition, on the post-TED form, where we typically have never had a question about infection, as this has been something that's quite burdensome to the sites and therefore is restricted to the research forms. We did not add a full infection section. We simply added a single question to ask if the patient had been infected with COVID-19. The next slide shows some additional questions that will be added to the pre-TED form for transplant and the pre-cellular therapy form. These questions are to capture patients who have previously been infected with COVID-19 and are placed in the comorbid conditions section of the form, where we typically capture the HCT-CI. And here we are asking three simple questions. Was the patient previously infected with COVID-19? And then if they had been infected, whether they were hospitalized and required mechanical ventilation. Those of you who know our forms well will again know that we do ask about mechanical ventilation in this section. And again, we've added the clarification that that question should be for non-COVID-19 reasons. Next slide, please. We, in addition, launched a new form to specifically collect data related to COVID-19 infection. This form is only going live in FormsNet on May 8th, as is the data on the few previous slides. However, we were able to put out this form immediately through our communication system known as ServiceNow, which data professionals at sites use to communicate with CIBMTR staff to have queries answered, to upload documents, and to do some of the other functions which are better handled through a secure portal between CIBMTR and sites. We were fortunate to have the backbone for this form which had been developed by Marcy Riches previously and is actually being used in one of the BMT-CTN studies, which is collecting stool samples for microbiome analyses. So some of you may be familiar with this form. It asks a lot more detail about the actual infection. So it is, of course, only for patients who have been infected. It is a voluntary form, and the data includes how the infection was diagnosed, how it was treated, and what the outcome of the infection is. At the moment, it is all done through ServiceNow, and that can continue to be done as long as sites are most comfortable with that. However, it may be easier for sites to start entering these data directly into FormsNet as soon as the form is live. The form will also be triggered by the question on both the TED track and the CRF track that asks whether the patient has been infected with COVID-19. And also within FormsNet, a site can at any time make this form due on demand. You'll know that there are other forms such as the death form or the subsequent neoplasm forms that can be made on demand too. And we think this will be very useful getting some of those reports. They may be at a phase where you're only having an annual form or even patient, and if you do want to report the COVID-19 infection in a more timely manner, that can be done with this on-demand functionality. We discussed with a large group of external advisors, which included many people from the ASTCT, including the infection SIG, about whether we should have a single form come due or whether we should have another subsequent time point. And the advice was strongly that we should have at least 2 time points for this form. So when this form is completed, the last question asks about the current status of the patient. And there are 2 options which will trigger a further form, which are improved or ongoing. Of course, if the infection is resolved, we'll not trigger another form, or if the patient has died. But in the circumstance of improved or ongoing, a second form will come due 6 weeks later, where we will ask for the progress of the patient. Although, of course, we will not ask all of the questions, for example, those that ask about the diagnosis and how that was made. Next slide, please. So the next series of slides, before I hand over to Doug, will be showing some of the actual data. Because we prepared these slides ahead of time, these are the numbers of cases reported to the CIBMTR as of April 27. However, I can tell you that as of this morning, we have had 60 cases reported to the CIBMTR. This particular graphic can be seen directly on the CIBMTR website. So if you go onto cibmtr.org, there is a banner immediately below the main banner. If you click on that, it'll take you to the COVID-19 reported data, and you'll see for today, for example, that there are 60 cases reported from 30 in the US or non-US reporting centers. On that page, we are showing the status of the infection. So again, as you can see here, we have this broken down into the categories of resolved, improved, ongoing, death, pending, and unknown. And some of them are pending because a form has not been completed in its entirety. I can tell you that as of today, there are still 10 deaths. When you look at these data on the website, there is then a further link just below it called See Data Breakdowns. And when you click on that, you will be able to be taken into another page which shows graphics. And if we go to the next slide, I'll give you some examples of those. This shows the reporting by day. So you can see where we started collecting these data, how many cases were reported each day for those cumulative totals of 60 today. And on the right-hand side of this slide, we'll show you how long after the infection the case was actually reported to us. So you can see that actually for the majority of these cases, the coronavirus infection is being reported to CIBMTR, in fact, in a very timely manner. Next slide. Here we have a breakdown by the region. You've already seen on the right-hand side the outcome. Although I don't have the functionality on this slide, if you go into the CIBMTR website, there's a very nice functionality that's being built into these slides, into these graphics. For example, if you're on the website and you click on the large orange part of the pie, so northeast, it will then show you in bold on all of the other slides the characteristics of those patients just within that area. So it's a nice way of being able to look at regional data or data by other demographics. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see the type of transplant. In fact, we've had 2 cases of CAR-T patients now reported to us as of today, and then the bulk of patients really receiving allogeneic transplant, but a largish number having autologous transplants. On the right side, this graphic represents the number of years post-transplant that the infection occurred. So the largest bar of 0 means between the day of transplant and 1 year post-transplant. But certainly there are some cases that are very far out from the transplant reported here. Next slide, please. We've also got the breakdown by sex and by the age, and you won't be surprised to see that age breakdown very similar to actually what we're seeing in the general population. Next slide, please. So before I talk about the impacts of the clinical trials, I'll just mention that the data on the CIBMTR website is refreshed on a daily basis each weekday. The graphics were just loaded yesterday, so for those of you who've been clicking on this for the last few days and haven't seen the pie charts or graphs yet, those became functional yesterday. So please go and have a play with them. I think they look pretty nice. And again, we had some great input from a couple of external investigators as to how to display that. And if anybody has other recommendations for things they'd like to see or how they'd like things displayed, we're very happy to try and comply with those. And so just on my last slide, I wanted to make the point that CIBMTR is also heavily involved in prospective research. The RCIBMT is our own prospective clinical trial arm, and then of course the BMT-CTN is very closely linked with CIBMTR in several ways, including the data collection. And as many of you will know, there have been large impacts to clinical trials too. And we went through a process similarly in both of those 2 research groups to decide which studies to close, which studies to keep going on. But for most of them, the accrual was suspended, and we also, for most of them, added additional data collection variables, either to look at the impact of an actual infection of COVID-19 in a trial participant, or to look at the impacts in terms of deviations or adverse events or other aspects that we can then track as we reinitiate these trials in the coming months. So I think that's my last slide, and I'll hand over to Doug.
Good afternoon, everybody. and I'll add my thanks to Bronwyn's for your interest and participation in the webinar today. I'm going to continue the theme of talking a little bit about research in terms of both some of the research that we're doing and the potential impacts of COVID-19 on our research agenda. And then I'll finish with some of our thoughts of how we might handle the impact of COVID-19 in the highest impact report that we produce from the CIBMTR, which is the Center Specific Survival Analysis. Next slide, please. So as I would suspect most of you have experienced at your medical center, most centers' research office and or institutional review boards have provided guidance to the center that in most cases suspended human subjects research that was not interventional or of clear potential benefit to the patient. So if studies were of limited potential benefit to a patient, then those activities were suspended across a large portion of US centers. And so that limited patient accrual to those, certainly at our center, for example, who didn't have a standard of care option, they could go on to a clinical trial as a new enrollment. Clinical trials, many of the clinical trials that were open were closed, and others did allow continued follow-up and treatment of patients who had already started, but no additional patients could be enrolled. I think a byproduct of that was that observational research, such as that is done by the CIBMTR, was often deemed non-essential across transplant centers. And this was despite the fact that the observational research, the outcomes database that we run, is generally considered to be minimal to no risk for the patients, and the consent processes are generally embedded in along with the routine procedural consent for transplant. Next slide, please. So some centers have prohibited, as I mentioned, all of their non-interventional research. And again, the reason for that is to minimize patient and staff contact and exposure to each other, and therefore transmission of the virus, particularly in the early days when we had less understanding of the infectivity and the transmission vehicles. We realized, though, that would have a negative effect on our ability to carry out some of our research agendas. So if we want to understand the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic on transplant, it's actually very important that we collect the data. And in some circumstances, as I've mentioned here, we are collecting data without consent because, of course, there's required reporting in the United States for all allogeneic transplants. But without consent for research, our ability to use those data to understand what the impact has been on the transplant population would be limited. So we've made the case, and we believe that the research restriction really should not apply to the CIBMTR observational database protocol, because clinicians can obtain consent directly from the patient at the same time that they're doing the procedural consent for the transplant or the cellular therapy. There's no required additional visits or assessments for the patients other than those that would be standardly undertaken as a part of the standard of care. So if you're at a center where this is an issue and you're not allowed to obtain consent from patients for participation in the outcomes registry, we would encourage you to find out whether your IRB may reconsider that. We work together with the ASTCT leadership to create a position statement that centers can share with their research office and institutional review board. We sent information about that to centers last week to both remind them of the reporting obligations under the Stem Cell Act, but also to remind them about the importance of research. The next slide, please. So, and I want to just emphasize that getting consent for research doesn't mean that a center is going to then have to figure out how to keep up with all the reporting that would go with that patient. These can be disconnected. So that even we always want to remind centers that consent for research is important, whether or not the patient is on the TED level reporting track or the comprehensive report form track. And we understand right now that a center where a physician might sit with a patient and get consent for the procedure and consent for the outcomes registry, that center may have a limited ability to keep up with data reporting. That's okay. Getting the consent up front is important so that eventually those data can be used for research. So I'll segue to say that we are continuing all of our standard scientific activities at the CIBMTR. FormsNet is open and operational, as are all of the rest of our data collections and center support systems. So we're fortunate in terms of our IT capabilities and our bandwidth, and so we really haven't had any challenges there. Move them from harm's way. And so all of our staff are actually working, and you may not realize it, but when you call in for service, you're reaching somebody who's not working in our office, but is working from home. It's very important you understand, many of you may be concerned about security and privacy. All of our systems are the same. People aren't working off of their unregistered, unlicensed home device. They're working on equipment that's all been within our security framework. For those of you who participate in our working committees, those activities are also proceeding, and we are actually trying to stay on top of our previously established timelines for studies. This is our business, and we're trying to continue business as best we can. We're meeting on a weekly basis, as we always have for our stats meeting. Our working committee leadership calls continue. All the new studies that were discussed at the TCT meetings went through their usual process of approval. PIs have been, or I believe by now have all been notified, and those studies are starting. Although we have also tried to reserve some hours for COVID-19 related research activities. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things that we've been looking at as is relevant to COVID-19? So even before we started having reported cases of patients with who have been infected with this virus, a very interesting question is, what's the impact of cryopreservation on transplant outcomes? As most of you know, then with the travel restrictions that went into place because of this pandemic, it became virtually impossible to have a patient fly to a different location to donate, and there were also some restrictions on even trying to move products. And because of the uncertainty, the NMDP issued different guidance regarding unrelated donors, such that their recommendation was to acquire the donor and have the product flown to the transplant center before the patient would receive their preparative regimen, so that the product could be frozen and available to avoid a circumstance where a patient could receive ablative therapy but not have a graft waiting for them. So we quickly realized the importance of this, and a couple of questions were brought forward in early March to the CIBMTR. And we actually have completed or are in the process of completing 3 relevant studies to understand the impact. The first one is in the second bullet point here, looking at patients who have received transplant for hematologic malignancies, where post-transplant cyclophosphamide was the post-transplant GVHD prophylaxis. That manuscript is available online now at BBMT. It was submitted in the first week of April. The last bullet point has also been submitted. This is a study analyzing patients who received cryopreserved grafts for non-malignant disease. That was also submitted, has been accepted with minor revisions, and so those data should be available within the next few days. And I just want to remind you that this is the power of an observational registry. we took events that centers have reported to us where a graft was cryopreserved rather than given fresh in our historic database, and then brought that forward to studies to describe the outcome. The third and last study in this category is the third bullet point, and that's looking at patients who have had a hematologic malignancy who received calcineurin-based GVHD prophylaxis. And in fact, we are starting the multivariate analysis of that this week and anticipate within the next few weeks that can also be submitted for publication. So we believe that these studies will help inform the evolving practice that has occurred because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. The other thing that you've helped us learn over time is to understand how safe is tocilizumab. Many of you know that tocilizumab is used for patients who have cytokine release syndrome after receiving cellular immunotherapy. And so we actually have a reasonable body of experience accumulated in the outcomes registry and have a manuscript that's been submitted. And I believe this also is provisionally accepted for publication. Again, with the idea that we are using tocilizumab for patients who become COVID-19 infected, who have serious lung involvement, in order to modulate the immune response, which may be part of why the lungs do poorly with this disease. And so understanding the safety of tocilizumab is potentially valuable for our patients. Next slide. So I'll use that as a segue into how has this virus changed how transplants performed. I've already mentioned the first bullet point here, which is that acquisition and cryopreservation of the donated stem cell product is now happening before the preparative regimen is initiated. So instead of a fresh product being infused for unrelated donors, the cryopreserved product is being infused. Now we know it's safe to thaw from cryopreservation based on our experience in the autologous setting, but this is a different way of doing things, and we want to be able to understand it. And so the work that we're doing now with data collection will be informative for the next generation of studies. We also know that this is important because in many cases, related donors don't just live next door to the recipient, and in some cases have difficulty traveling to the transplant center where the recipient is scheduled to receive their transplant. And so being able to acquire that product and freeze it gives some assurance to the recipient that they'll have a product waiting. Another important thing is that as all of us around the world try to conserve personal protective equipment, the number of bone marrow harvests, which was already going down, has decreased further as a way to collect the cells for engraftment. And so there's a higher proportion of patients receiving peripheral blood stem cells rather than bone marrow as their product type. And there's potentially a small increase in the number of cord bloods that are being used. I mentioned earlier that this virus affects the lungs, and in some cases, centers are avoiding pulmonary function tests and spirometry because of the risk of infection. We anticipate there may be some drug shortages that would affect the preparative regimen or other supportive medications after transplant, given the impacts to manufacturing around the world. We know that many transplant centers have delayed allogeneic transplants for less critical or less time-sensitive transplants, including some non-malignant or chronic diseases. We know many programs are not doing outpatient transplants, so another, if you will, headwind on the number of beds available for doing transplant. We don't yet understand what it'll mean, but we know centers have converted much of their follow-up to virtual, and what that might mean for patients who are in the early period after their transplant and whether all of their complications are being recognized early and managed quickly is an unknown. And I don't think we should underestimate the potential impact of a patient who receives a transplant spending a month in the hospital without any visitors, which is certainly the case at some of our transplant centers. Next slide. So the next slide, please. So our So all of this has an opportunity to have an impact on the highest impact report that we produce from the CIBMTR, which is Center-Specific Survival Analysis. So the impact for this year, that is the report that we are currently undertaking, is somewhat limited. Most of our centers have already provided responses to data queries for the information necessary for this year's center-specific analysis, which we would be analyzing over the course of the next couple of months and reporting later this year. And at the current time, we are proceeding as planned. But we do know some centers have had some limitations, and so we're trying to walk the balance of respecting the limitations at centers while asking if centers can at least get their survival up to date so that it can be included in the report. So we're sort of in the final process of determining whether this pandemic will affect this year's timeline for the center-specific analysis. Next slide. Perhaps more challenging or more interesting is to think about what could be the impact on the future reports. So we anticipate that next year is the first year that the COVID-19 pandemic could influence centers' performance, or at least influence survival of transplant recipients, because it will include patients who have been transplanted in 2019. And you saw from the limited number of infections reported to us that a substantial portion of those, perhaps a third, had occurred in the first year after transplant. So that means that somebody who got transplanted last July, their first year of survival won't occur until this July. And so they'll have had the opportunity to experience mortality related to COVID during next year's reporting period. The incidence of this infection is variable, as is treatment resource availability, and that variability is across the US. New York, Boston, and other places have had very high incidence. So we can't say that it's necessarily had a consistent impact across all transplant centers, and it may even have a differential impact on patients depending on their other comorbid conditions. We have to think about what it will mean that centers may not do spirometry, which is part of the comorbidity index, something that we do adjust as a pre-transplant factor. We're still trying to sort out or think about how delays or changes in when the transplant is performed might affect the outcomes. And we have added a question to our pre-transplant form to ask about patients who might have recovered from a COVID-19 infection and then go on to transplant. And it's not yet known really what those persons' outcome might be. Next slide. So we have, I want to reassure you to tell you that we have started thinking about how are we going to approach next year's center-specific analysis where these patients will potentially be included. You know, the point of that analysis is to study the things that centers have choices over and how that affects their outcomes. And some of the changes that have happened because of COVID-19 don't necessarily represent choice. So we're trying to collect the data that we need that would help us adjust as best as possible in this analysis, understanding, of course, that that won't be perfect. So what could we do? It's not clear yet what we will do, but we could consider eliminating a certain period of transplants where we just might not be able to adequately risk adjust from the analysis. We could try to adjust for the expected outcome based on geographic disease incidence. I'm not exactly sure how we would undertake a different methodology to count deaths that occur because of COVID-19 as opposed to the more usual causes of death after a transplant. I have a couple of good ideas about how we can use an adjusted HCTCI that doesn't include the lung function across all centers, but that's really a small piece of the equation. But most importantly, we anticipate over the next few months getting more insight from groups like the ASTCT Quality Outcomes Committee from some of the physicians who participate in our leadership committees of the CIBMTR. And I anticipate this to be a major discussion topic at this Center Outcomes Forum that we have held biannually for the last decade, the next one of which will be occurring in February of 2020. Next slide. So I think that's really the end of our prepared remarks. We've tried to leave a little bit of time for questions. Just to remind you that we are trying to communicate well about what we are doing in the time of epidemic. And so many of you have seen our e-blasts, and we plan to continue to do that. We're storing all of our communications from our webpage, as Bronwyn mentioned earlier. And for those with interest in the Blood and Marrow Transplant Clinical Trials Network communications, those are available through the BMT-CTN website.
Okay. So Doug and Bronwyn, I really want to thank you both for sharing with us some of the proactive steps that the CIBMTR is taking to support centers and to maintain the integrity of research. And all of this ultimately, as we all know, impacts patient outcomes as well. And I hope all the participants on this webinar understand the importance of why centers need to continue reporting these data to the CIBMTR during these challenging times. And I really appreciate the fact that, you've nicely elucidated that you recognize all the challenges that centers are facing and are proactively trying to adapt and support centers in this process. So if you have questions, please do use the Q&A feature in the Zoom call to share those with us. There are a few questions that have come through, and I can get the Q&A session started. The first question is for Doug Yeo. One of the questions was, what aspects of the COVID-19 forms are voluntary and what aspects are mandatory?
So thank you, Navneet. So as most of you know, we operate as the contractor for the Stem Cell Therapeutic Outcomes Database as part of the CW Bill Young Transplantation Program. And in that context, there's a requirement to report all allogeneic transplants in the US, and the forms that are used for that purpose are the transplant essential data forms. So those forms are not voluntary for allogeneic transplant recipients. The 2149, the respiratory virus post-infusion form that Bronwyn spoke about, that Marcy Riches and others developed, that form is a voluntary form, which contains additional information about the coronavirus infection that a patient may have experienced.
Okay. And the next question is for you, Bronwyn. So can you clarify what you mean Form 2149 is operational in ServiceNow? Because the understanding is ServiceNow is where sites ask questions and communicate, whereas FormsNet is where they access active forms.
Yeah, thanks, Navneet, and thanks for the question. That certainly is the correct understanding of the normal way of things. Typically, we request that all data be submitted electronically via the FormsNet application, and that is really where 99% of our data comes in. However, as some of you will know, that the ability to make very rapid changes to a large bespoke data collection mechanism is sometimes not immediate. And so what we needed was a mechanism to be able to collect data very quickly. And we thought this was a pretty nice solution because it is the exact same form, but it's a fillable PDF, meaning that once all of this data has come in on the fillable PDF, we can add it to FormsNet so that it will ultimately be in the same place. So all of these 60 forms submitted so far will just be keyed in by our staff and then merged into the rest of the data collection. But ServiceNow is an application. It is primarily for communication, but it does allow the uploading of documents because it's also where we collect all of our regulatory materials, data sharing agreements, all of that type of thing. And it is encrypted. And so there are no security issues with providing, even identifying data through the system. And so it was a short-term plan B, if you like, which was fit for our purposes, but will not continue once we can get everything into FormsNet. So thank you for that question.
Okay. Thank you, Bronwyn. Doug, I'm going to direct the next question to you. Can you talk a bit more about the options for remote consenting for the CIBMTR forms reporting? How can centers think about that? And I mean, what about consenting at a later date after the transplants happen?
Hi, sorry, it took me a second to come off mute. And I'll ask Bronwyn, who I think is a little closer to that than I am, but several things I think to keep in mind. I know at our center, for instance, if you wanted to consent a patient, you don't even have to collect the piece of paper from that patient. I know at our center, you can give the patient the consent form, let them keep it, and undertake procedures to record the consent by a witness and the consenter remotely in the EMR. And so I think that centers have to each on their own determine the best procedure to consent a patient. But yes, a patient could be asked to provide consent to supply the data to the CIBMTR later than their transplant date if they did not have the opportunity to do so before the transplant was undertaken. I think it would just be important to describe to that patient that all of the transplant-related information would be provided as a part of that consent for research.
Yeah, that is that's the
add?
determination of the NMDP IRB that initial consenting can be done through remote mechanisms as long as finally there is a signed consent form. And you know, we judge that is it highly unlikely that there won't be a patient contact on the day of start of conditioning. And so we you know, our determination is that most people will have a consent form, a physical consent form prior to starting their conditioning.
Mm-hmm. So Bronwyn, maybe I'll direct the next question to you. I mean, how do centers address patients where clinically they have presumed COVID based on their clinical manifestations, but the testing is negative?
Yeah, I think that's a question that we're all grappling with across the board. You know, as many people know, an observational outcome registry is probably not the best way to be addressing that question. I think it's a much broader issue. And in addition, we do know that we're unlikely to capture the complete denominator of cases, especially with some aspects of our reporting being voluntary. So, you know, I think that's a difficult issue to resolve. We certainly do think about it, but I don't think that we have the ability to collect that sort of data without it being a real burden to the sites where interpretive determinations need to be made and submitted.
Okay. And are there any ongoing efforts to harmonize data collection with the EBMT, and for that matter, some of the other registries out there, like the American Society of Hematology and so forth?
Yeah, I'll take that as well, Navneet. Thanks for the question, Nancy. The EBMT is also collecting data on COVID-19 positive patients. I do not believe they have put any questions about prior exposure into their data collection mechanisms yet. Although the data forms are not harmonized, we of course are collecting some of the same fields, you know, did they resolve, what was the outcome, did they get treatment, and of course, all of the transplant or cell therapy details attached to the patient, which, you know, that's one of the benefits of collecting all these data within an existing registry, is that nobody has to duplicate entry patient demographics or disease status, etc. And all of those data elements are harmonized between the EBMT and CIBMTR. So we do believe that we will be very able to prepare some collaborative reports on COVID-19. We're also at CIBMTR talking to ASH about their data collection mechanism. and the ability for us to push and pull patients back and forth between that so that we can make sure to share the data but not increase burden to reporters by having to duplicate entry.
So Doug and Bronwyn, I think we're out of time here, and we have a few more questions coming through, which we'll share with the CIBMTR, and hopefully you can address them through the communications you send out to centers. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time. And Kira, I'll hand this back to you.
Thank you, Navneet, and thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today. We are out of time. As a reminder, we will be posting the recording of this webinar and the slides on our ASTCT COVID-19 community page on our website. So if you go to astct.org, there is a banner at the top of our website that will lead you right there. The link is also here on the screen. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us via email or any of our social medias as well. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for coordinating the meeting. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.